Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Palliative Care Chalk Talks. We have a really fun series we've been doing, interviewing key players in hospice and palliative care from all over the country. And today I have the privilege of introducing and interviewing a longtime participant of our Chalk Talks, kind of since the beginning, Dr. Gerald Wilmes. Jerry has been practicing an eclectic, holistic, integrative blend of internal medicine, psychiatry, ethics, hospice, and palliative medicine for 35 years. He was very involved in the development of both hospice and palliative care at the system and entity level for SSM Health. This included serving as physician representative for a system team charged with implementing palliative care across all entities. He has been and remains a champion and advocate for quality care at the local, regional, and national level. Jerry continues to explore ways to better care for people. Recently, he co-facilitated a CPE unit with a longtime chaplain colleague that he worked with, both in hospice and palliative care. And so the way that our interview will work today is I have some questions that I've discussed with Jerry ahead of time, and we'll go through those together. But we do want there to be a dialogue. So hopefully there'll be a few minutes at the end. If questions emerge for you along the way, we'll open up the floor towards the end. You can include those in the chat function or just unmute yourself when the time comes. But welcome, Jerry.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I would be remiss. I've told Marty and I told Kristen, and I think I've mentioned it in the chat, but thank you all so much for these. These have been a breath of fresh air, the Friday Chalk Talks, and so thank you.
Thank you. Let's start out with just an overview. Can you tell us about your journey to and within palliative care?
Well, as you said, Kristen, when I got the questions, I thought about this. So I would say in retrospect, my journey began well before medical school even. I did not follow a traditional path. I did some other things before I decided I wanted to become a physician. And so immediately, and I'm a product of the 60s and 70s, so that's relevant, I think, because you questioned everything, right? And so I was immediately, I would say disillusioned is probably not too strong a word when I got into medical school, and then began searching, exploring friends, colleagues about, how to do this better. And I don't mean that as critical, it was just what I was feeling at the time. And so not surprisingly, probably who became my best friend in medical school had served as a hospice volunteer. And we were both kind of in that, seeking and searching for maybe a better way. And this is in the 80s. And so I would point out that, hospice was here, but it really wasn't well known, and palliative care really wasn't, that term wasn't used much at all. So fast forward, completed training, and then kind of serendipitously, fate or whatever, I was asked, because I was just in a fairly conventional practice in rural Missouri, to lead the development of a branch of SSM Hospice in the most rural outlying entity site that they had, rural Northwest Missouri. And so, as you mentioned, and I put in the introduction, I just felt like that was a blessing. And so I've served as a hospice medical director and a physician for 30 plus years. And then several years later, as part of SSM Health, they began putting together what they call the Palliative Care Initiative to implement palliative care in all the various sites, including the rural Northwest Missouri site where I'm at today. And so I'm just going to stop there, and it's been a rich, rewarding journey, and the journey continues. So I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and I'm sure you'll share more of these details kind of as we go through the questions. What advice would you offer to those of us starting our careers? And what advice would you share with a younger version of yourself?
Well, I think I would say, like I said, as I looked through the questions, I had two thoughts that were almost simultaneous. Wow, what great questions, and yeah, what tough questions these are. So I think, and I'll give the caveat again, because this is my perspective. I kind of cringe inwardly from an imposter syndrome to say that I can impart any advice or certainly wisdom, but it was my own perspective and experience. So I guess my advice to people early in their careers would be, to the extent that feels normal, seek out and search what you want palliative care to be for you. I would, we've all heard this phrase, and I listened to a person about medicine in general years ago, and it's always stuck with me, and it's especially true for palliative care. I think it's almost an insult to the field to call it a career. It is a calling. I think it is truly a calling. And so I would not impose mine. I really had no choice. I think, as I mentioned, in my personality and the way I came into medicine, I had to do this for myself, to seek out and say, is there a better way? Because, the medicine of the 80s, we've come a long way in general, but the medicine of the 80s was pretty technical, reductionistic, whatever you want to call it. And it really wasn't in any way, shape, or form whole person care. And then I guess the second question, a younger version of myself, I can't even remember a younger version of myself, so I don't know what that is. But I think it would be largely the same, and maybe I think people that have known me would, in the field and personally, would describe me as a nonconformist, maybe even a little radical. I guess my advice to myself would have been to push a little harder, maybe be a little more radical. And I, quite frankly, and I have no regrets, don't get me wrong, but I imposed some limitations because I love the outdoors, and I'm a small town boy. So I'm never going to a large academic medical center, but I think at times there were things that I thought, boy, if that wasn't in a big city, I'd like to do that in palliative care. So that's all I would say on those questions, Kristen.
Thank you, Jerry. What do you think differentiates a good palliative care or hospice care provider from an aspirational one?
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, that's all right. The second part to this question is, how can we work towards that goal of being a good or excellent palliative care provider?
Again, great questions, and that always is equivalent to tough questions. And I'm sorry to cut you off, because I've thought about this a lot since I received the questions, and my answer, quite frankly, has evolved. I think just a quick version of my original answer was, the good palliative care provider knows all the technical aspects of, the evidence, current evidence base, and with whatever discipline, what is considered best practice. That was my original answer. And the aspirational one somehow pulls in a bigger picture, and the softer skills, I hate to use that term, but the softer skills of palliative care that are not able to be quantified to a large extent. The reason I said that was my original thought on my response is because that's evolved. I'm going to submit, somewhat intentionally provocatively, that you cannot be a good palliative care provider without being an aspirational palliative care provider. So I think, as we'll talk, as through the time we have, I think it's my current answer where I'm at on December 3rd is, in order to be a good palliative care provider, you have to be an aspirational care provider. And that's part of what we'll talk about in the next few minutes, I think.
Jerry, I like that answer. And it's not surprising to me, because so far I hear your vision for this field and how that compelled you over these 35 years? I like that answer. That's all I'll say.
Thank you.
The next question I'm wondering is, what is something that you see colleagues early in their careers struggle with? And what advice might you give for how they can overcome that?
I think it's obvious a lot of the questions, there's overlap, a lot of overlap, and I wouldn't presume to know, other than conversations I've had with people earlier in their career. I think one or two things can happen. I think there are some in the field, I think that's a minority that, how shall I say this? I have training in psychiatry. I'll make the analogy between psychiatry and palliative medicine. I think there was both, and it's not a bad thing, but both kind of tried to fit in with conventional medicine, so that they would be, respected as real, real healthcare. And I think that's certainly understandable. I think in psychiatry and palliative care, we have to have that scientific, technical research, evidence base, but we need to hang on to what is special about both of those. And I really think if psychiatry is done right, there's a lot of overlap with how we approach, and I'm going to use the term a lot philosophically, palliative care. People push back on me on this, but I believe anyone who's reached this point in their careers or their training can learn competencies about the technical aspects. I think this is what to me is important, and is what we need to be striving for.
Thank you. Tell us about a case that has stuck with you and why.
Well, I didn't do my assignment very well. I thought about this one though, Kristen, and I have kind of, obviously in that long of a period of time, there have been tons of them. I'll respond by saying, we've all heard that saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And I think if we remain mindful and being fully present, showing up, I know that term's common. I don't like showing up as much as being present, I think, but in whatever way, I guess my point is, I could cite literally thousands of patients and they've each taught me something else. And I would extend that. We all have our own personal experiences. There are situations that I won't get into in my personal and family life that would fall into the realm of palliative care. And I don't want to list those as cases, but if that makes sense, I could do that if you pin me down and say, yes, do that. I can think of, I'll just mention one, even though I said I wouldn't. Some of the most the cases that I learned early on, and I mentioned again that I was in medical school in the 80s. Two things, you all know, that's when HIV and AIDS became a thing, and we didn't really know. And so healthcare providers often were not too excited about even going into a room because we didn't know yet enough. I mean, I started med school in '83, and that's, in the next year or two, that's when that happened. And then just beyond that, patients that as a medical student, and like I said, that was kind of my challenging the system about how patients were treated, as the pancreatic cancer in room 19, for example, and just countless stories. I think if we're open, we are the recipients, we are the beneficiaries of what our patients can teach us.
Thank you, Jerry. You've mentioned throughout your answers here the importance of kind of mastering the technical side of medicine, of remaining up to date on research and best practices. And so I'm curious if you could share with us a newer publication that's influenced your practice and how.
I'm kind of smiling because I didn't do this assignment either. I mean, our standard, from a technical aspect, I think our standard literature from each of our disciplines is so important. As a member of AHPM, our journal is the Journal of Pain and Symptom Management, and there's a Journal of Hospice and Palliative Care, and there's podcasts now, and there's things like this. So I don't know and then from textbooks, there's all the standard textbooks and the latest edition, but I'm going to segue, and that's one of the things that I've had reinforced to me here is a lot of the stuff that I read now, beyond staying current on the technical aspect, is about the philosophical aspect. If that makes sense, I'm cheating, so you can stop me, Kristen. But here is an example. In my recent library on palliative care, with the virtual background, I awake at the bedside. I can't remember if you mentioned that before. Maybe that's where I found out about it. But there's another book called Contemplative Caregiving, and I think it's the refinement of the skills. I think about, Cicely Saunders has always been a hero of mine, and I could cite about a million. I know we've had Diane Meyer on here, and the Ira Biox, and I could, Ann Allegra. I don't know if you've heard of her, but in the Missouri, in the Kansas City area, she was a pioneer as well. And so you mentioned, and I intentionally put that in the bio about the CPE, because for me personally, the spiritual component of hope. I mean, I don't know how you talk about whole person care unless you incorporate spirituality, however people define that. But that's a long rambling answer to, hopefully you're not too upset that I didn't answer the question. I'm going to plead that, I didn't know you meant technical stuff.
Well, either side of this palliative medicine, I think it's great to hear kind of the texts that have been shaping you, as well as it sounds like recent experiences. And I'm going to go and deviate from the assignment as well here, Jerry, because it was only recently that I learned you co-facilitated this CPE unit. And as a chaplain who's been through a few units of CPE now, I was curious about your experience, and if there's anything in co-facilitating the CPE unit that surprised you or that's impacted your own practice.
I think I'll answer the second one first. It definitely impacted my practice in terms of just nourishing what's inside me about what's the continual journey to improve palliative care. The thing that I guess surprised me was probably showing my ignorance about CPE in general, just in terms of what the students, it's, as it's a very rigorous curriculum, and I felt honored and blessed and thankful that I didn't have some of the assignments. The backstory on how I co-facilitated, I had been bugging, my colleague's name is Sally Schwab. She's recently retired, but we have known each other pretty much from the beginnings through ethics committees and my journey in hospice and palliative care. We've known each other, and I'd bug her every few years, hey, what do you think about me doing a CPE unit? And she said, sure, and then that wouldn't happen and then I think the last time I asked her, I think she knew, she said, well, how about if we do this? So you kind of co-facilitate. I'm obviously the subject matter expert on how you do a CPE unit, but you weigh in on that interface between, the physician, that role, and the chaplain role. And it was just a very rich, rewarding experience. We just completed it in the middle of this last month in November. And so it was great.
I admire you for the ways that you get outside of your own disciplinary lane and interact and learn from other disciplines. I've noticed this throughout our conversations in Chalk Talks over the past few months, that a lot of times you have an excitement or passion about these interdisciplinary conversations. And maybe even, I'm curious if that comes from, in part, of frustration with how siloed different departments are in the hospital. So I guess this is me throwing in another question. Do you have a vision for how to improve interdisciplinary communication?
My own self-analysis is I'm pretty good with vision. Implementation, maybe not so much. So yes, I think we've all seen, I'm not going to list my things that have been aspirational for me on how we do this. I don't know if I mentioned, but I think I mentioned in the bio, I don't know, but I was, when I was part of SSM Health, I was one of the 2 system board of directors for the Supportive Care Coalition, which is a Catholic consortium of palliative care for healthcare organizations. And my point in that, it just like this, I had exposure to lots of different healthcare organizations that were doing really tremendous stuff at continuing the journey of trying to improve, not perfect, but improving that. So they're really, to answer the question, Chris, and I think the aspiration, my hope would be that we truly, in all places, and I don't think this is, I mean, I know it's being recorded, but I hope it's not being used as blackmail later, because I'm the place I'm at now, without getting into details, the healthcare organization I'm with now acquired SSM Health. And it's been a little bit of separation anxiety for now over 2 years. And I'm not saying you can't do this without being a faith-based organization, but we have challenge, I'll put it that way, in having a truly interdisciplinary team, and I should probably stop there. It's a little, so back to your earlier comments about frustration. So part of my drive and aspiration is I'm always, and you said getting out of your lane. Do you know what that means? Sometimes you get slapped for getting out of your lane. Get back in your lane. But for me, it's really not a choice. Well, that's cool.
Jerry, I'd like to open it up now to some other questions. And I see one from Tim here, or a comment. He said he spent several years in rural Northeast Missouri and liked hearing your passion for rural medicine. Tim, did you want to say anything more about that?
Well, no, I just, Jerry, it's great to see you and meet you, and I enjoy these talks as well. And my time in that Northeast corner of Hannibal, good old Mark Twain area, we really struggled with the whole concept of palliative care in an integrated model. We finally got it right, but we're very familiar with SSM, but really appreciate all your focus on that rural care, because we really struggled with how to do it there.
Well, let me tell you honestly, Tim, thank you for reaching out. It's great to meet you. And it sounds like you were ahead of us before, because we still don't have it right here. And I think real quickly about in medical school, I went to a wellness conference of all things. God forbid doctors in training would go to but the reason I think of that is I met a fellow medical student that was there, and they again were kind of outliers, but she said, well, what you want to do, isn't it going to be kind of tough in a rural area? And I was young and ideal. No, we can do this anywhere. And so to your point, Tim, yes, it's a lot more challenging in many ways in rural areas.
Marty.
Jerry, thank you. We really appreciate having you on today. Sometimes after I'm done talking with a patient, I'll get the question, are you a psychiatrist? Or sometimes it'll be, are you a psychologist? Or are you a chaplain? You happen to be many of those things. What would be a good answer to that question? How would you answer that question?
This is going to sound trite, Marty. I think it's a great question, but I think I would say I'm a person who's here for you, and I have this background. There's two things that I think of a lot that have kind of guided my daily life, because I think with my struggles, I have to be constantly reminded about humility. But it's part of the conversation. I want to get a sense, and I may ask them, why do you ask? Because I don't want to presume to be, what I'm not. And so I think exploring, I guess, the question in verbal or nonverbal ways to get a sense, and that's part of what we do is, whether we're having family meetings or communications, as it's always been said, as a procedure, is both what's being said and what we pick up about what's not being said.
Yeah, you'd answer the emotional question instead of the cognitive question. Thank you. Yeah.
And that's conversely, and I'm sure you've all experienced, this is not from the patient side, from the professional side, it's sometimes frustrating because in palliative care, since they know I have this training, well, this person has uncontrolled delirium or dementia. What meds do you want to give them? And I think your question addresses, can we talk about this a bit first? We may need to get where we need to use medication, but there's so many steps that even people in the field sometimes say, out of pressure, to say, let's go straight to the med.
I suppose I have one more, Jerry. You've talked about you've referenced the differences of working in a rural context and the unique challenges that are there. And I was thinking about that and thinking about even small hospitals that maybe their palliative care team is a nurse practitioner and a social worker. And I'm curious about any advice you might give them. You mentioned that you've done a lot of advocacy to build the palliative care team. So maybe advice along those lines?
I think my advice, Kristen, would be never give up, keep trying, because as I told Tim, I don't sell myself as a success story. This is an ongoing work in progress. We had, I would say, a significant setback when we were acquired by Mosaic. No criticism of Mosaic, but it's a different framework, and we've almost kind of had to rebuild. And like you said, the palliative care team, at times, when you say a nurse and a social worker, that's a little liberal for what and so it's a constant, coming back, turnover in sometimes organization, but in administrators and buy-in and finances. So yes, it is, and that's kind of what I meant before about, in some ways, it seemed like it'd be easier if I could get over my aversion to big cities and say, yeah, let's go do this somewhere else. But I think everybody knows, I know Tim knows, and I'm sure you all know, there's no greater need than in rural areas for both psychiatry and in this context, palliative care. And so I think that's what keeps me going, is just, yeah, we got to do this. And it's kind of like one step forward and two steps back. But again, I want to say one last time, because things like this, the Friday Chalk Talks are, it's energizing for me, and it keeps me going. So thank you all again.
Thank you, Jerry. It has been such a privilege. Okay.
Can I say one last quick thing? This is part of, I debate, sometimes I think, I was told that if you're presenting, this isn't presenting, this is just trying to answer questions, but you shouldn't have too busy of a virtual background. I just want to stress, the day-to-day mindfulness that you've all talked about in terms of your own well-being. This is a picture of a place up in Montana, and if I move, there's a very primitive cabin that I sometimes go to there to refresh. So thank you all and have a great day.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jerry.